In this video, I'm going to replace the starter in a 2007 Honda Fit. So it's a first gen Honda Fit. The suckiness level of this job is fairly high unless you have small hands. I do not have small hands apparently because it was a bear. Things that I struggled with seemed like other people didn't really struggle with. If you like the video, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe. It does help support the channel. I think the getting it out was about 4.5 hours. Getting it back in was about an hour and a half. Mostly just trying to struggle with accessing some of the bolts. And then kind of once you figure it out, then they're not too hard. It's just trying to figure it out. Takes a little bit of time. The nut that's holding on the power cable from the battery to the starter for my car was a 12 millimeter. A lot of people said there was a 13 millimeter. So just FYI, it could be apparently either. But for mine it was a 12. I have a few links below for some of the tools and stuff if you're interested in purchasing them. You know, it does help me out, helps out the channel since I do get a little bit of commission from Amazon. But without further ado, let's get cracking. Of course, cars never break at the most convenient of times. So the starter went out in the old Fitskis here. It's buried down right there. Basically, if you're looking at the front of the engine, there's not a whole lot of room there, so a lot of this is going to have to be accessed from the bottom. The first step is we got to remove the dipstick tube. So there is, right there's the nut you have to be removed that's holding the dipstick tube, and then you got to wiggle that out. It's a 10 millimeter. There's a clip holding this radiator hose on. It's going to have to be disconnected. Down there you can see it, that gray circle around the radiator hose. And then the next steps will be to I'm going to jack up the car and get underneath it and start undoing some of the wires and some of the bolts. So of course breaking the dipstick tube loose is going to be a pain. I got a screwdriver in here. You know, never underestimate the power of wiggling. I grabbed it with some pliers and it kind of flattened one side when I was trying to pull it out. I've used that to actually help me twist it a little bit, and that's going to help break it free too. And then, I don't think it'll come out yet, but it feels pretty loose. Now that I've jacked the car up, I can go underneath. This is the dipstick tube coming in right here. It's easier to grab it from underneath. I removed the oil filter because it's just in the way, and then it'll actually help when getting the starter out anyway. So now I'm going to go underneath here, grab it, try to see if I can get it loosened up, and then using this pry bar right here to get underneath the lip. There's like a little bevel on the dipstick to get underneath it and help try to work it out that way as well. So it's going to be a little bit of a pain. Unfortunately, that's just the way it is. It's out. So again, the reason they need this pry bar is because you need it at like a slight angle to kind of get underneath this a little bit. So once you start wiggling, then you start tapping it so that you can get it in, and then you start pushing it up, and then eventually it'll pop out. Not fun again. But it's the other option you can do. I've seen somebody do is you can grab it with a slide hammer up here and some pliers and yank it out that way. If you have a slide hammer available, you can usually pick up something like this at auto parts store fairly cheaply, and it's just nice to have around anyway. So more useful than a slide hammer to go out and buy one of those. Now to undo the clip down holding the radiator, I think this just using a pry bar is going to be the easiest here from the top. You could also probably use a long screwdriver. You may be able to access it from the bottom, but this seems like it's the easiest. All right, whatever you do, make sure you disconnect the battery. There is pretty much a wire that goes directly from the battery to the starter, and so it'll be bad news bears if you get in there and you start trying to remove that wire while the battery is still plugged in, because you will find yourself in a very sparky situation. All right, so let's do that. So 10 millimeters. I'd just undo both just to be safe. So there's a 10 millimeter here and a 10 millimeter there, and then you just pull the trigger. Wow, look how rusty that starter is. So that's it right there. That's the end of it. And this is on the other side. This is the bolt right here, the bottom one that holds it in. So I'm going to remove these bolts first before trying to get to the wires. I think that'll be easier. I believe this is a 17 millimeter. It should be fairly accessible, maybe with having universal joint on this end to bring it out a little bit for a little more clearance might be nice. But you can see that starter, no wonder why it's dead. It probably is not much left of that case there. That is has seen some days. All right, let's do this. All right, just to give you an idea of the setup I have here, I have a socket down on there and then a U-joint right behind it. And then I have about I don't know, 9-inch extension. And then I have my ratchet. And then that goes to a breaker bar. But as you can see, allows me to get out from underneath the car and get a little leverage there and break it loose. It was definitely a tricky one to get. I did remove one vacuum line. I wanted to remove this line too, but it's actually a coolant line. So I started to remove it and then coolant came out, so I put it back in. But it did make it easier to just, so I put the socket on from the top and the universal joint with the extension here. And then from the bottom I put the 1/2-inch universal because I didn't have another 3/8 universal joint. And that goes down to a 1/2-inch extension, which then comes all the way down the car and allows me to loosen it from down here. Now the trick is to get it to an angle, and you know, both the U-joints that they're the most successful at being able to loosen it, and that requires kind of pushing it up against the AC compressor a little bit, I believe, and against the bottom of the radiator mount here. So that's one way to do it. I'm sure there's a few other different ways to do it, but this is how I'm kind of getting it done right now. Okay, now that that top bolt's out, I have to remove the wire harness here. This is, I think, for the oil pressure sender. And then we can start working on getting this thing out. After that, you know, I'll be trying to get the wires off the back of the starter, which is going to be fun too. All of it's fun. This is a big, fun adventure. Of course, the starter's not going to want to come out, so what I was able to do is get this pry bar down here. And if you haven't noticed, that this pry bar is a pretty handy thing to have. There's a little tab at the back. I'm trying to see if I can see it. You can see it. Probably can't see it, but you can see where my pry bar, where it stops, there's a little tab there. So I'm able to get the pry bar on the tab and then actually hammer it, you know, up here. And that's actually allowed the starter to start coming loose. Okay, so I ended up removing the oil pressure sender, which is where that hole is. It's 24 millimeters. I've seen people get a wrench on it. I don't know how they got it off. I used a deep socket with like a shorty. Like the ratchet was thinner, so I was able to fit in like a normal sized deep socket, and ratchet seemed to get stuck. So I was able to then reach up and get the socket on here. Everybody's been telling me that it's a 13 millimeter, but mine's 12. So that kind of threw me off. And there's some other issues I'll explain a little bit here shortly. The phone's too close for me to even see if it's focused or not. But once you get the main wire unhooked, you're able to access. You can see the other clip right here. That's how, at least gives you some visibility there. You have to push it back down here. I'm going to try to use a screwdriver to help me get it off. But yeah, fun stuff. Okay, so this is putting the new starter in, but at least you can kind of see how my wrench is positioned, and that's kind of how I was able to get it off the old one. It's very tough. There's a lot of interference in there, and there's not a lot of room to tighten it. And getting the new one on, getting it hand started was not fun either. As you can see, if it just moved, the starter's not actually installed into the bell housing yet. That is, I left it kind of loose so that if I needed to move it around a little bit. Getting the other wire harness plugged in was not that big of a deal here, but All right, so now that that's pretty much tight. One key was I used that pry bar to push that rubber boot out of the way because that thing just kept getting in the way. So now I'm trying to think of any other tips. Okay, here's the 14mm bolt on top. I was actually able to reach down from the top with my hand to get it started. Now I haven't tightened the 17mm bolt on the bottom simply because sometimes you have to wiggle things in order to get it, but this one started not too bad. It is handy to have a light. I don't know, I got this Harbor Freight light that's been pretty darn handy. Well, there's a magnetic thing, there's things stuck to the back, but you can like stick it on stuff. I have a review about this thing and I would suggest getting one because it gets handy for stuff like this. You can also have a different light where it's a big old wand. So sorry for that little plug right there, but it's just, I do found it handy. I didn't have it earlier because I do misplace things. So got it started by hand, and then what I'm gonna try to do is the same way that I loosened it, I'm gonna try to tighten it. So nothing too crazy there. I might try to go up from the top now that I have two 1/8" swivel heads or universal joints. All right, so here you can get an idea of how I got the socket, then a universal, then about a 6" long extension, then another universal, and then about a 9" long extension. And actually that does pretty well. So that's not how I got it out, but that's how I'm getting it in. And if I was to have to get it out again, this is probably how I would do it. Though it does, the interesting thing with the universal joints is I kind of hold over here with one hand because they kind of want to bind up, and then and kind of adjust the position of this one over here so that's as kind of as straight as possible, and that makes it so that they work as smoothly as possible. So there's a little bit of work there, but it's definitely a lot easier than what I was doing before. So just start buttoning things back up. Like I unplugged the took off this vacuum line, so I put that back. I loosened the wire harness, so there's a bolt, you know, right down here and over here that needs to be put back on. Dipstick tube, that's what this wood's here. So you go underneath the car, get it started, and then you use this piece of wood here and a hammer to tap it down into place. So I can't hold the wood and hammer and hold the camera at the same time. I don't have 3 arms. So you'll just have to figure that part out. Then put the oil filter back on, maybe change your oil since you have it off. All right, apparently I finished just in time. Snow's coming down. Let's button her up the rest of the way. So with the 13 or the 12mm for me nut above the starter, this was the issue I was running into. So this is the socket I usually use, which is a Tecton impact socket, and it's worked for just about everything, and it's just convenient because I have this kit that I use. It's just well organized, and so I pretty much just use those sockets. And yeah, they're a little thicker and all that stuff, so they're not, for some situations they don't work, but in general for most of them they do. I was struggling trying to get that 12mm nut off, and because I couldn't quite get clearance, and I didn't really think about it, but there's about a 1/4 of an or 1/8 of an inch difference in height here, and that 1/8 of an inch really played a role in how easy or hard it was to remove that nut. So just an FYI, if you're really struggling, maybe the socket you're using might play a role. So that's just something that I found. If you like the set that I have, there's a link down in the description that you can get it if you like, with some other stuff. All right, thank you. I hope the video was helpful. If you have any constructive criticism or questions, please leave them in the comment section below. I'll try to get to them as soon as I can. And have a good one. Thank you.